This past Wednesday, November 29th, Washington lost a giant with the death of Henry Kissinger at 100 years old. Kissinger, who was an accomplished scholar outside of his political and diplomatic achievements, was integral to U.S. foreign policy during the Nixon and Ford administrations, and his legacy continued to loom large for the decades to come. We'd like to pay our respects to Mr. Kissinger and reflect on his legacy. Miles, we've spoken a bit about him before on this podcast. He's obviously a man of some controversy on segments of the left and right for his contributions to American foreign policy. How do you think about the legacy he left behind?
Well, it's very hard to use a very brief statement to summarize such a very complex man. So, as you indicated in your question, there's many ways you can approach about this. First of all, I think the nation should be very grateful to Mr. Henry Kissinger because he was the first person who really introduced a huge amount of intellectualism in American foreign policy discourse. Long before he became a politician in the White House and the State Department, he was first and foremost a scholar at Harvard. And his contribution to our understanding of the geopolitical theories and in the nuclear age is really immeasurable. So for that, we should be very grateful to Dr. Henry Kissinger. Secondly, and I think the second part of his career, so having said that, he's a brilliant strategist, number one. Mm-hmm. And then he entered the White House after 1968 election. He became the National Security Advisor to Mr. Richard Nixon in 1969. And that's where controversy comes, because in that role, he really sort of highlighted the profound conflict and dilemma of being an intellect and a policy person. So that's why, you always have this kind of a conflict. That's when, essentially, his job in the White House, he became a presidential fixer, to fix problems of the time. And at the time, obviously, the Vietnam War was a big thing. So that's why he had the shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, obviously, as another crisis too, and then Vietnam. But he's most famously known for his role in the opening of China in 1971 and 1972. And so when we say Henry Kissinger is the most relevant in the China field, both will talk about that trip to China in 1971, and then that paved the way for Mr. Nixon's visit to China in February 1972. That is very important. But the reason why he went to China, Nixon sent him to China, was not because of some kind of really grand geostrategic vision. Of course, there was some element to that, but mostly to solve some kind of very specific question. The most important one was the Americans' quagmire in Vietnam. So they want China to help them. And it was the Chinese who basically constantly tried to elevate the level of the discourse with the United States at the much more strategic level. Most importantly, China wants to forge an alliance with the United States against the Soviet Union. Remember, up to that point, China had steadfastly refused Americans' appeals to get engaged because China really didn't believe that the United States harbor any good intention. Only after the 1969 Soviet-Chinese brinksmanship that almost led to the nuclear mutual annihilation, that China realized Soviet Union was such a big threat. They want to play the U.S. card. Play the U.S. card they did, and did very well. So you have to look at it from that point of view. The third part of Mr. Henry Kissinger's legacy has something to do with his great success in being a businessman and a commentator. You combine the business enterprise with his great influence in the commentary world. That has really given this man an enormous power and influence. So he built a business empire, and also his opinion on world politics has staying power. But I also have to point out one of the reasons that Mr. Henry Kissinger was so powerful, so influential, was almost in spite of him, because he was chosen by the Chinese Communist Party as the ultimate friend of China. So the reason why he's so powerful, because Chinese government gave Mr. Kissinger exclusive access to the inner core of the Chinese Communist Party's thinking. And with that kind of exclusive power and almost near monopoly to the Chinese senior leadership, and Mr. Henry Kissinger became a very, very powerful figure because everybody who wants to understand China, and they go to him because Mr. Henry Kissinger was known as the ultimate China whisperer. So that's why you see how this kind of business and public opinion really mixed. This extraordinarily influential man, extraordinarily smart guy, and extraordinarily controversial person.
I think that's well said. For our next topic, Miles, you recently testified before the Select Committee on the CCP on the topic of discourse power, the CCP's strategy to shape the global information space. Discourse power, you write, is for the global community what the term propaganda is for China domestically. And you mentioned 4 primary means in which the CCP shapes perception. That is disinformation, elite capture, self-censorship, and brainwashing. Could you expand on this and give us a brief overview? What is discourse power and why should we be concerned with it?
Well, the best way to explain that is to watch the whole hearing. I joined 2 other panelists. We had a great time, and I'm very grateful to the committee for giving me that opportunity. Propaganda is no problem for the Chinese Communist Party domestically. That's because the Chinese Communist Party control all the tools of information generation and information dissemination. So they have total control of access to information. That's why they can do that. Internationally, they couldn't do it. That's why their international propaganda has to be very subtle. So they sugar-coated and masqueraded as a pursuit of what they call the 话语权, which literally is translated to the right to speak. But as I explained in my hearing, that was not really the original intent. The original intent for the CCP, when it comes to the right to speak, is not just to present its story, narrative well. Rather, is to dominate the dialogue, to make the Chinese Communist Party's narrative the only one available in the world. So that's why discourse power has a lot of element of coercion in it. But it's also very, very, they have to do it very delicately and deliberately. That's why I delineated 4 major categories. This information is greatly aided by the advent of the information revolution. There's a lot of mass distribution and dissemination tools, social media in particular. So China banned all of them from outside. Twitter, Google, Facebook, you name it, right? So none of them is available. But the Chinese government party's officials, those people who are in charge of this discourse dominance project, they have full access to those tools of free expression. And so ultimately, the tools of free expressions in the West, such as Google, Twitter, and Facebook, have become the Chinese Communist Party's tool to destroy freedom of expression. So that's very, very important and telling. And secondly, of course, China tried to change the global conceptualization about China. And they tried to insert communist ideology, their nomenclature, into international body, particularly like the United Nations, World Bank, and the WHO. For example, Xi Jinping's thoughts and his view about socialism with Chinese characteristics in new era was inserted in the UN documents. And his champion for this very bizarre concept of a community of common destiny for all mankind has been written into UN documents. So those efforts has been very, very robust and rigorous. Of course, they try everything to control Chinese diaspora all over the world. And there's tens of millions of Chinese immigrants living overseas. And they control this through not only their direct consular facilities all over the world, but also through high technology. I mentioned in my hearing about the Chinese use of Amazon. Amazon.com is the largest e-commerce platform in the world. There are about 1.5 sellers on Amazon. Over 2/3 of them, 1.1 million of them, are based in China. Think about that. So this gives Chinese government an enormous opportunity to exploit this kind of a high-tech commerce mechanism. And so they use this Amazon.com as a platform to dominate some of the very critical areas of personal and national security. For example, I mentioned in my hearing that Amazon.com, the Chinese sellers literally have a monopoly of all the home security devices, routers, Wi-Fi extenders, and so you name it, mini computers. And so it's very, very dangerous for us Americans to be hooked into that kind of things. They also have the device to change the entire TV viewing environment in America, as if you were sitting here in the United States watching Chinese TVs unhinged. So that's the problem. And of course, the next thing I talked about in my hearing was the Chinese were very adroit cultivation of proxies. In other words, I use the phrase elite capture. Unlike the Soviet Union, Chinese government rarely sends its propagandist overseas to pitch Chinese propaganda directly. Rather, they spend a lot of efforts, their best and brightest, to the Americans' elite circles, Wall Street, the K Street, and particularly think tank roles, to cultivate proxies. And so they let those guys who speak to the American, to the world, on behalf of the Chinese government. So you often, because this appeals to ego and the vainglory of a lot of people. I mean, how often do you actually get the access and authentic messages from the Chinese government per se? And you, a regular researcher, can speak for the entire nation. And you try to explain to the Americans, you know what, this is what Chinese think. You know, if China killed 2,000 people somewhere in a square, and then all those proxies will jump out and say, hey, listen, let me explain the context with which Chinese government had to do this. So try to justify the brutality of Chinese government. It happens all the time. This is exactly what's been going on in the current crisis in the Israel-Hamas war, because there's so many pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist intellectuals in the West try to sort of contextualize, justify Hamas's October 7th atrocities. I went on to talk about self-censorship among all of us because China controls a large body of international communication in social media, in particular TikTok at all. And so therefore, everybody who wants to have to do anything wants to have any career in the China field or do any business with China, you have to watch what you say, what you tweet, what you email. And that's basically is fundamentally un-American and anti-freedom. So brainwashing obviously is very simple because Confucius Institute and a lot of Chinese direct propaganda and the conferences, and they send people here to inject a lot of Chinese communist concepts into the American society. Words like progressives, words like consciousness raising, they all have the etymology of the CCP, dating all the way back to the 1940s.
I actually found that to be one of the more striking elements of your testimony, the suggestion that CCP ideological influence is not a far off or even an immediate concern as we often think about it, but rather something that has been permeating our society for some time. So I just wonder if you could expand a little bit more on that. You mentioned these concepts like raising the level of consciousness. So to what degree does it already permeate American society today, and how does that maybe cause us to be vulnerable against them in the coming tension?
I mean, just about this particular phrase, right? Consciousness raising. In Chinese, it's called 提高觉悟. That phrase came directly, straight from the 1941, 1942 Communist Party's Yan'an thought reform, thought rectification. It's also a purge. So basically, it's a draconian thought reform, thought minding, thought rebranding campaign. It's basically indoctrination at the extreme with extreme cruelty. That phrase was conveyed to the American mainstream through the wartime correspondent of the Time magazine in China. His name is Theodore White. Theodore White got that phrase and written into his books, his correspondence, and the American the liberal side of this social movement picked it up. This consciousness raising is literally the motto of, for example, the American feminist movement. And most of them probably didn't know the origin of this phrase. It came directly from the indoctrination camp of the Chinese Communist Party of 1941, 1942 in Yan'an.
And, so some of these things, it seems like there are solutions that, while they might not be easy, they're clear. For example, like we can ban TikTok. We know we can disband CCP influenced and operated academic organizations like Confucius Institutes. But some things seem harder to me, like elite capture. Are there specific measures we could be taking to mitigate this particular avenue of influence, especially if, as you say, it's something motivated a lot of times by ego on our side and sort of just the enticing nature of access and things like that?
First of all, we have to understand the nature of such Chinese effort. It's not really normal academic and scholarly exchange. For example, we're here, working for one of the think tanks in Washington, D.C., but there are a lot of think tanks. They accept a lot of Chinese exchange researchers whose job here is to influence, to cultivate the praxis. And Hudson Institute obviously is not really welcomed by the Chinese government because we are very different. But I think there are a lot of Chinese scholars, and they work in various kind of government functions with the cover of scholar coming over here. And I have some fresh evidence that, but I don't want to talk about in the open air. What it also is that they want us to treat China as a normal country, as a country with the normal woes and up and downs, as if China, number one, is a market economy, as if China is just a developing country, as if China is seeking mutual benefit. So they spread the gospels of Chinese Communist Party's win-win gobbledygook, and they also spread the gospel of CCP's idea about peaceful reunification with Taiwan. So those coded words carry implicit messages that were completely false in the first place. So win-win, how could you win when you basically restrict the Americans' access to your market and to your economic data? And you cannot compete with somebody who doesn't follow the same sets of rules. So that's why win-win is just garbage. And many people fall into that kind of a conceptual and intellectual trap and couldn't really escape. So we have to understand the nature of the regime, what they're doing, what's the purpose of that. And secondly, of course, you can always instill a very strict set of transparency rules, disclosure rules. So that's something that we should have done. We didn't do enough. And during the Trump administration, we actually sent the message to various think tanks to urge them to open up their disclosure and make a statement that they can guarantee, assure the American public and the government that they have not taken foreign money, and if they did, they have to disclose it so that there will be no suspicion of conflict of interest.
For our last topic, I would like to check in on the upcoming Taiwan presidential election, which is fast approaching in little over a month on January 13th. This election obviously has immense significance for Taiwan and the world, as it could determine how willing Taiwan is to defend its independence or whether it is willing to capitulate to Chinese aggression. Miles, can you give us a brief overview? Who are the candidates, and in your view, what is at stake in this election?
First of all, I'm not going to take side with any of them. But basically, we have this sort of a three-way horse race. Leading the poll as of now is the incumbent vice president, William Lai Qingde is his Chinese name, and his running mate, who was the Taiwan's top diplomat in Washington, D.C. until about 2 weeks ago, Representative B. Kim Xiao. The second pair is the candidates for the Nationalist Party, the KMT. So it's led by this gentleman by the name of Hou Youyi. And the third candidate is a former mayor of Taipei. His name is Ke Wen-je. The issue, obviously, you mentioned about this is a decisive, this is a very meaningful, consequential. And in a true democracy, every presidential election is consequential. So Taiwan started this full democratic process in 1996. Even though the incumbent won but the process was open and fair. And in 2000, there was a presidential election. For the first time, the opposition leader actually won. So that presented an enormous opportunity to showcase Taiwan's democratic maturity. Taiwanese people did a great job. They transformed. They basically have a power of transition of power very smoothly, including the intelligence and the defense establishments. Now, it's not 100% smooth, but overall, it's just remarkable. And then ever since we have several presidential elections, every one of them is crucial. It's crucial because facing Taiwan is the enormous issue of how to deal with China. So the Chinese Communist government threatened to use force to take over Taiwan for decades. They have never relented that promise. And the excuse, the pretext they're using is that there is a Taiwanese pro-independence movement, which in my view is total red herring. It didn't exist because the Taiwanese leaders, past and present, have always said there is no need to seek brand new Taiwanese independence because Taiwan is already a sovereign and independent country, and its name is Republic of China in Taiwan. So that's basically, it's not about declaration of new independence, it's about recognition of a de facto real independence that's already in existence. So for China to insist otherwise is just very, very disingenuous. Unfortunately, we have some people in American think tanks and academia who basically did not really care about this kind of reality. And for example, there is a foreign affairs article that published last week, which basically blamed the victim of CCP's belligerence and calling the DPP party to get rid of its Taiwan independence clause, which was incorporated in the 1991 DPP platform. And that was just silly because these people didn't do research very well. Because in 1999, that clause was already being frozen by the DPP's new resolution. It's called the Resolution on Taiwan's Future. So in other words, the DPP itself no longer really was calling for Taiwanese independence because they know the reality is independence. 2 years later, in 2001, the DPP adopted a new resolution getting rid of the Taiwan independence clause altogether. So no one except the CCP has been spreading falsehoods about this issue, except the authors of this recent foreign affairs article. So it's not very helpful and creates such a stir. So I would say the issue right now that face Taiwanese voters are not only about governance issue, but also it's about the overall strategic outlook of Taiwan's future. That is, to what extent we should recognize the status quo. The status quo is basically the status quo independence. To what extent that we should really stick to the global dialogue on Taiwan. In other words, it would not be an issue of whether Taiwan should belong to China or not, but rather it should be really a dialogue framework of freedom versus tyranny, democracy versus the autocracy. So I think that's what Taiwanese people were thinking. Hopefully Taiwanese people will make the right choice. I think historically, since 1996, they have always made a good choice.
One thing I might want to add as a question, I've seen some recent reporting that something the U.S. audience is missing is the importance of sort of everyday domestic, especially economic issues driving Taiwanese voters. From our perspective, it's certainly the most pressing thing is their relationship with China. And I have to imagine that's at the top of people's minds. But to what degree do maybe we have a warped perception, and are there other issues at the forefront that could drive this one way or the other?
Listen, Taiwanese people have been threatened by China for over 7 decades. In the very important sort of really regime-changing election of 2000, I was in Taiwan as an election observer. Chinese government officials behave belligerently. I remember very vividly when the Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji went on TV and using very harsh words threatening Taiwanese voters with the use of force, and the people basically rebel against that. So every time the Chinese government they play hardball, it will always backfire. I mean, they never learn the lesson. So I would say, right now they're trying to sort of interfere with Taiwanese election. If I were a Chinese Communist Party leadership, I would just learn the lesson, just shut up. And Taiwanese democracy, let it run its own course. So, of course, communists will never do that. That's the problem with the autocracy. I feel very confident that the Taiwanese people are smart. And even if a KMT were to be elected, they still have to solve this fundamental question about the party itself. Yes, it is a sort of a transitional party from mainland to Taiwan. But after 7 decades, KMT should really have a clear-cut statement about whether the KMT party that existed only in Taiwan is a Chinese political party or a Taiwanese political party. And that's why they have to really make that distinction. And for all practical purposes, KMT is and will be just a Taiwanese political party. And I don't think there's politicians within the KMT courageous enough to make that statement.